Gideon Voss slammed his fist on the trading post counter so hard the glass jars rattled off the shelf and shattered across the floor. "Get them out," he said. Not loud, not shouting. Something worse, the kind of quiet that meant he'd already decided. "Get that woman and her brats off my land by morning, or I'll have the sheriff do it." The trader, old Abe Finch, didn't move. "Gideon, she ain't on your land. She's on the road." "She's standing in front of my post asking my customers for work." Gideon turned, and his eyes moved to Eliza Vane like she was something he'd found stuck to the bottom of his boot. "You got nothing. You are nothing, and nothing doesn't get to beg in my town." Eliza held her children's hands, Mason on her left, Clara on her right, and she did not look away. She wanted to. Every part of her wanted to fold, to apologize, to make herself smaller so the moment would pass faster. But Clara was 7 years old and watching her mother's face. So Eliza stood straight, met Gideon Voss's eyes, and said the only thing she had left to say. "Then we'll be moving on." If you've ever watched someone speak to a person like they were less than human, if you've ever stood in a room where no one defended the person who deserved defending most, then you already know exactly what kind of story this is. Stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. And drop a comment below. Tell us the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1886 in the Montana Territory was the kind of summer that didn't apologize for what it did to people. The grass turned the color of old straw by June. The creek that ran behind the Vane property, what had been the Vane property, slowed to a thread of brown water by July, and by the time August came around, even that was gone. The ground cracked in long, jagged lines, like something underground was trying to pull the earth apart from the inside. Eliza had watched that creek dry up from the kitchen window of the house she no longer lived in. She thought about it sometimes, on the walk, the way the water had just quit, the way things you counted on could disappear so slowly you almost didn't notice until the moment you reached for them and found nothing there. Thomas Vane had been like that creek. He hadn't left all at once. He'd left in pieces. A missed payment here, a lie told quietly there, a week's absence explained away with work he couldn't name, and money that never came back with him. By the time Eliza understood the full shape of what was happening, the debts were so stacked they blocked out the light. $32 owed to the feed supplier, $14 to the hardware man, $68 to a land broker whose name she hadn't even known until the man showed up on her porch with a piece of paper that made her house no longer hers. Thomas had signed that paper. He just hadn't told her. The morning they were put out, Eliza dressed the children before dawn. She didn't let them watch the men carry out the furniture. She braided Clara's hair slowly, the way Clara liked, with the braid going over one shoulder instead of down the back, and she told Mason to bring the blanket from his bed because the nights were getting cool. "Where are we going?" Mason asked. He was 10. Old enough to understand that something had gone very wrong, young enough to still believe his mother knew the answer. "Forward," Eliza said. It was the only honest thing she could tell him. She'd packed what she could carry, the worn blanket, a bundle of clothes, the tin of dried beans she'd been saving, and the photograph of her own mother, taken years before in a photographer's shop in Ohio, the paper edges soft from being held too many times. She left the sewing machine, not because she wanted to, because it weighed 40 pounds, and there was no wagon to carry it. She looked at it once before she walked out the door. She didn't look back after. The road out of Millhaven was empty that morning. Most people were still asleep. A dog barked from somewhere behind a fence, and Clara asked if they could take the dog, and Eliza said no, and Clara didn't cry, but her chin did that particular thing it did when she was deciding whether to cry. "The dog has a home," Eliza said. "We don't," Clara said. "We're going to find one." She said it with more certainty than she had any right to feel. They walked for 3 days. The first day was the hardest because of the blisters. Eliza's boots were worn down on the inside heel, and the right sole had a small separation that let road dust work its way in with every step. By midday, her foot was rubbed raw. She stopped and cut a strip from the bottom of her petticoat and wrapped it inside the boot, and she kept walking, and she did not mention it to the children. Mason carried the bundle. He didn't complain about it. He was the kind of boy who'd learned early that complaining didn't actually change the weight of a thing, just made the walk longer. Clara walked beside Eliza and asked questions. She asked why the sky turned orange before dark. She asked if there were bears in the tall grass. She asked whether the trading post in the next town would have peppermint sticks. And Eliza said she didn't know. And Clara thought about that for a long while, and then said peppermint sticks weren't that important anyway, which was the most gracious lie Eliza had heard in years. They slept this first night under a cottonwood tree, the blanket spread across all three of them. Mason went to sleep fast the way boys do. Clara stayed awake longer, turned toward her mother in the dark. "Mama," she whispered. Are you scared?" Eliza looked at the stars for a moment. The kind of pause that was not evasion, but just the time it took to decide how much truth a 7-year-old could carry. "Yes," she said. "A little." Clara was quiet for a moment, then, "Me too, but I think you're going to figure it out." Eliza didn't answer. She pulled the blanket tighter and listened to the night sounds until Clara's breathing slowed. She didn't sleep much. She spent most of the dark hours thinking about what was ahead, not in a fearful, spinning way, but methodically. The way you think when you don't have the luxury of falling apart. She had 2 children, 43 cents, and a body that still worked. She had 2 hands and a mind that had kept a household running for 11 years with half the resources it needed. She had done more with less so many times that she'd stopped thinking of scarcity as a problem and started thinking of it as a condition you worked inside. She just needed a door. Someone had to open a door. She found out about Wyatt Holloway from a woman at a water pump on the second day. A thin woman with a baby on her hip who looked like she hadn't slept in several years and had made peace with that. "You looking for work?" the woman said. "Anything honest," Eliza said. The woman tilted her head toward the east. "There's a rancher about 6 miles out, Holloway. Lost his wife 2 winters back. He's been running that place alone and it's starting to show. He's not an easy man." She paused. "But he's not a cruel one either. There's a difference." Eliza thanked her and adjusted the bundle on Mason's back and kept walking. 6 miles on a cracked road with 2 children and a wrapped foot and 43 cents felt like a considerable distance. She covered it in 2 hours. Holloway Ranch sat at the end of a long dirt track flanked by dry brown grass that hadn't been managed recently. The fence line was holding, but only just. She could see 3 posts that had leaned and hadn't been straightened, and a section of wire that had been patched with a different gauge. The barn roof had a slight sag on the western end. The house itself was solid enough, but the porch had a board missing from the second step. She noted all of this the way you note things when your brain has learned to read a place quickly, to understand what was being neglected, what was being managed, what had simply been one person's job before it became nobody's. Wyatt Holloway was at the fence when she arrived. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, wearing a canvas shirt gone gray from too many washings, and he was reattaching a wire that had come loose at the post. He heard them coming and turned, and his face did not do anything particularly welcoming. He looked at Eliza. He looked at Mason. He looked at Clara. His eyes came back to Eliza. "Help you?" he said. It wasn't unfriendly. It was just economical. The word choice of someone who'd been talking to himself too long and had stopped wasting syllables. Eliza stopped at the gate. She didn't open it. She put her hands together in front of her, not clasped, just resting, and she said, "My name is Eliza Vane. These are my children, Mason and Clara. I'm looking for work. I can cook, I can mend, I can manage supplies and keep a house from falling apart at the edges. I noticed your second porch step is out. I can replace that too. I'm not asking for wages, just a roof and meals for the 3 of us, and whatever surplus you can spare when the season turns." Wyatt stared at her for a long moment. "Who are you running from?" he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was honest curiosity. "My husband's debts," she said. "He left. The debts stayed." Wyatt looked at the children again. Mason was standing straight, chin up, doing his best impression of someone who hadn't just walked 6 miles on empty. Clara had found a beetle on the fence post and was watching it with the absolute focus that children reserve for things they intend to study at length. Wyatt said, "I don't need charity cases." "I'm not asking for charity," Eliza said. "I'm offering an arrangement. If I don't work, we leave. You owe us nothing." Another silence. The beetle completed its journey across the fence post and disappeared into the grass. "There's a room off the back of the house," Wyatt said finally. "Small, 1 bed. Your boy can take the loft in the barn if he's willing. He's willing, Mason said, before Eliza could answer. Wyatt looked at him. Something shifted in the man's expression. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one that had passed through and left a slight trace. Supper's at 6, Wyatt said. I don't wait. He turned back to the fence wire, and that was that. They were inside. The room was small the way he'd said, barely large enough for a narrow bed and the blanket chest beneath the window. But it had a door that latched, and walls that were solid, and a window that faced south toward the open land. And when Eliza set the tin of beans on the windowsill and sat on the edge of the bed with Clara leaning against her, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Not safe. Not yet. But the particular weight of a door between herself and the open road. She sat with that for a minute. Then she stood up and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was the room that told her the most about Wyatt Holloway. Not because it was dirty, it wasn't exactly, but because it was clean in the way a place gets when someone is maintaining a function without caring about the space itself. The pots were stacked, the flour was in a sealed tin, the cutting board was warped and had been flipped to use the flatter side, but not replaced. There was a coffee tin with a slight rust ring on the shelf where it sat, and beneath the rust ring was a circular stain that had been there a long time. This was a kitchen that had once been kept by someone who cared about it. Eliza could feel the absence. She didn't rearrange anything that first evening. She cooked what was in the pantry, salt pork and dried cornmeal, which wasn't much but combined into something warm, and she set 3 places at the table with the dishes she found in the second cupboard. Wyatt came in at 6. He washed his hands at the basin, dried them on the towel that hung on the oven door, and sat in the chair at the head of the table without ceremony. He looked at the third setting. Clara was already in her seat. Mason slid in across from her. Wyatt picked up his fork. Nobody spoke for a moment. It's salt pork, Eliza said, though he could plainly see that. I know what salt pork is, Wyatt said. I'll do better when I know what you have. He ate. The children ate. Eliza ate. It was not a comfortable meal, but it was not an unpleasant one. It was just 4 people at a table who didn't know each other yet, moving through the quiet the way you move through a room when the furniture hasn't been arranged yet. Halfway through the meal, Wyatt said, not looking up, "What happened to your foot?" Eliza blinked. "My boot." "You're favoring it." She hadn't thought she was showing it. "The sole came apart a bit. I wrapped it." He chewed, said nothing else. She assumed that was the end of it. After supper, while she was washing the dishes, she heard him come back through the kitchen and set something on the table. She turned. It was a pair of boots. Smaller than his, leather worn but intact, soles still good. "My wife's," he said. "About your size, I think." He walked back out before she could respond. She stood there with her hands in the dishwater and looked at the boots for a long moment. She picked one up, turned it over. The sole was sound. She set it back down and finished the dishes. The ache that lived in her chest these days, the one that had moved in somewhere around the time she understood Thomas wasn't coming back with the money, the one she'd been managing the way you manage a bad knee, working around it, not putting full weight on it, loosened slightly. Not gone, just shifted. She dried her hands. She would earn her place here. That was the arrangement. She would earn it the only way she knew how, by making herself indispensable before anyone realized they'd let her in. The question was how long she had before someone tried to push her back out. She found out the answer to that question 4 days later, when Gideon Voss rode up to the front gate and called for Wyatt Holloway to come out. Eliza was on the porch mending a split in the harness leather, one of 3 tasks she'd identified in the first morning as quietly urgent, when she heard the horse and looked up. The man on it was large in the particular way that money can make a man large. Not just physical size, but the extra dimension of someone who had rarely been told no and had let that become part of how they took up space. He didn't look at her directly. He looked past her, toward the house. "Holloway," he called. Wyatt came out. Gideon Voss smiled the way men smile when they're not really smiling. "Got yourself some charity cases, I see." "Got myself some help," Wyatt said. "That what you call it." Voss's eyes finally moved to Eliza. He studied her the way you study a fence post that's in the wrong place. "Word gets around. People talking about you taking in strays, Wyatt. Doesn't look good." "I don't recall asking for your opinion on how my ranch looks." "No." Voss shifted in his saddle. But I'm your closest neighbor, and I'm telling you as a friend, getting mixed up with a woman who comes with that kind of story attached to her is bad for business. Her husband left debts all over the county. You want that kind of shadow on your property? Eliza kept her hands on the harness. She kept her eyes on the leather. She kept her breathing even. But her jaw was tight enough to ache. Wyatt said, "What she had with her husband isn't my business, and it isn't yours." Voss leaned forward slightly. "I'm saying it because I'm thinking of buying that southeast pasture from you, Wyatt. We talked about it. But I'm not going to be in business with a man who's got that kind of situation complicating things." There it was. Not a request. A lever. Eliza set the harness on the rail and stood up. She knew the moment she moved that she should probably stay still, that speaking was a risk, that Wyatt hadn't asked her to speak, and that this was his ranch and his negotiation, and that the wisest thing she could do was let the men talk and not become a problem. She also knew that if she sat down every time someone decided to make her the problem, she would be sitting down for the rest of her life. "Mr. Voss," she said. He turned. He looked at her now, directly. "I don't know what my husband owed or who he told what story to," she said. "What I know is what I've done this week. I've repaired that harness, replaced the step on the porch, rehemmed the linens that were fraying before they could tear all the way through, and reworked the pantry storage so the flour tin isn't sitting near the heat source. What I earn here, I earn with work. What happened before this gate is not what's happening inside it." Voss stared at her. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't touch the rest of his face. "She talks like she owns the place already," he said to Wyatt. "She talks like someone who's done 4 days of work," Wyatt said. His voice was flat. "Come back when you want to discuss the pasture without the rest of it." Voss held there for a moment, calculating. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the track without another word. Eliza picked up the harness and went back to the mending. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. But she kept her face pointed down at the leather and breathed slowly and kept the needle moving, and by the time Mason came around the corner of the barn with a question about the water trough, she looked like someone who had been sitting on this porch all morning with nothing more complicated on her mind than a piece of worn leather. That evening, Wyatt sat on the porch steps after supper, the new step she'd replaced on the second day, and she came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without being asked and sat in the chair nearby. They didn't speak for a while. The sun was going down somewhere behind the dust haze to the west, and the light it left behind was the particular reddish-brown that the summer evenings had out here, the kind that made the land look like something in a painting, except for the smell of dry grass and cattle and wood smoke which reminded you it was just Tuesday. "You didn't have to say anything to him," Wyatt said. "No," Eliza agreed. "But you did." "Yes." He drank his coffee. "That's going to cause problems." "It was already going to cause problems," she said. "He'd decided that before he rode up." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's not wrong that he can make things difficult. He controls the water rights on 2 of the side properties. If he wants to, he can make things very complicated come spring." "I know," Eliza said. "I'm sorry." "I didn't say it to make you sorry," Wyatt said. "I said it because you should know what's ahead." She nodded. The red light deepened and faded. From the barn, she could faintly hear Mason talking to one of the horses. She couldn't hear the words, just the cadence of it, the low, steady murmur of a boy deciding to be comfortable somewhere. "That boy of yours," Wyatt said. "He's got a good way with the animals." "He's got a patient nature," Eliza said. "Doesn't always seem like it on the surface, but underneath it, he's very patient." "That'll be useful," Wyatt said. She looked at him. He was watching the last of the light. She thought about what the woman at the water pump had said. Not an easy man, but not a cruel one. She thought about the boots on the kitchen table. She thought about the way he'd said, "Come back," without the rest of it to Gideon Voss, flat and final, no extra words. She drank her coffee. There were going to be problems ahead. She knew that. Voss wasn't finished. The debts attached to her name weren't dissolved just because she'd crossed a county line. The winter on these plains had a reputation she'd already started planning for, and she was 3 days into a household she hadn't had time to fully assess. But the door was open. And for tonight, the coffee was hot, and the step held her weight, and her children were inside this fence line instead of outside of it. She kept that thought close. It was enough to build on. The morning after, Gideon Voss rode away. Eliza woke before the sky turned light and lay still for a full minute, listening to the sounds of a place she didn't yet know well enough to trust. The house settled differently than the one she'd lost. Lower creaks, different intervals. The wind came from a different angle out here, more from the northwest, less from the south, and it moved through the gap under the back door with a particular whistle she'd already started to recognize. Clara was breathing slow and deep beside her, one arm thrown over her face the way she always slept, as though she was defending against something even in dreams. Eliza got up without waking her. She built the fire in the kitchen stove before full light, and by the time Wyatt's boots hit the floor upstairs, she had coffee made and the oats on. She'd found a jar of dried apple slices in the back of the second pantry shelf, tucked behind a tin of baking soda and a bottle of liniment, the kind of thing that gets pushed back and forgotten, and she'd added them to the oats with a small pinch of the cinnamon she'd seen in the spice shelf. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was trying to make the kitchen feel less like a room someone was working in and more like a place someone lived. Wyatt came down, looked at the oats, sat without comment. He poured his own coffee. He ate 3 spoonfuls before he said anything. Dried apple. Back of the second shelf. He looked up briefly. I forgot those were there. I know, she said. They were behind the liniment. He went back to eating. Mason came down 20 minutes later, his hair going in 3 different directions, still carrying the look of a boy who'd been dragged out of sleep before he was finished with it. He sat down and ate without looking at anyone, which in Eliza's experience meant he was thinking about something specific. What's the fence situation on the north pasture? He asked eventually. Not at anyone in particular. Halfway between Eliza and Wyatt. Wyatt looked at him with something that might have been surprise if it had been given a little more room to develop. Where'd you hear about the north pasture fence? Walked it yesterday, Mason said. 3 posts are soft at the base, one's already starting to lean. If you don't reset them before the ground freezes hard, you'll lose that whole section in the winter melt. A silence. Wyatt set his spoon down and looked at Mason the way you look at something that turned out to be more than it appeared. You walked the whole fence line? Most of it. When? While you were in the barn. Wyatt said nothing for a moment, then, takes most men 2 hours to walk that line. Mason shrugged. I walk fast. Eliza kept her eyes on her coffee cup, but she felt something loosen in her chest, something she'd been holding for 3 days without quite knowing it. After breakfast, Wyatt took Mason out to look at the fence posts. Eliza and Clara were alone in the kitchen, and the quiet that followed the men's leaving was different from the usual quiet. It had space in it, the particular kind that children move into when they feel they can. Clara said, Is Mr. Holloway nice? He's honest, Eliza said, which is better. Clara thought about this. She was braiding a piece of the leather cord that had come unwound from the harness, working it between her fingers slowly. What's the difference? Nice is easy, Eliza said. Honest is harder. Nice people tell you what you want to hear. Honest ones tell you what's true, even when it costs them something. Clara considered this with the deliberate seriousness she brought to most things. Then, the man on the horse yesterday wasn't nice or honest. No, Eliza said. He wasn't. He looked at you like you were something in the road. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Some people decide what you are before they've looked at you long enough to know. That's not about you. That's about a door they've already shut inside themselves. Clara turned the leather cord over in her hands. What do we do about people like that? We don't become like them, Eliza said, and we keep working. The first real test of whether Eliza could hold her place on Holloway Ranch came not from Gideon Voss, but from the ranch itself. She'd been there 9 days when she walked the barn properly for the first time. Not the quick walkthrough she'd done on arrival to get her bearings, but the slow, systematic kind where you look at everything and let it tell you what it needs. She'd waited 9 days on purpose. You learned more about a place by watching it work before you started adjusting it. Rush in with changes and you might fix the thing that didn't matter and miss the one that did. What the barn told her was more serious than she'd expected. The structure itself was sound. Wyatt had built with care and with materials that held up. But the organization inside, the way the hay was stored, the position of the feed supply relative to the animals, the drainage channel that ran along the east wall, all of it reflected decisions made by someone working alone and working fast, building systems for survival rather than for any kind of long-term efficiency. The hay was stacked directly on the floor against the north wall. In a dry summer, that was workable. In a wet season, or a winter with the kind of snowmelt that came with a hard thaw, the moisture would wick up from the ground and work through the stack from the bottom. By the time you found rot in the middle of a hay bale, you'd already lost a week's feed before you knew it. The feed sacks were stored too close to the wall where the wind seam ran, the narrow gap between two boards that had separated slightly over the years. Not enough to see daylight through, but enough to let cold air knife in all winter. Cold air plus feed grain plus the small amount of moisture it carried equaled exactly the conditions that brought mice and eventually mold. And the ventilation, or the lack of it, meant that in a cold snap, moisture from the animal's breath would condense against the roof boards and drip. Not every night, but on the nights it was cold enough, you'd get a slow, steady drip that nobody necessarily noticed until the hay directly beneath it was already damaged. None of it was dramatic. None of it was the kind of problem that announced itself the way a broken fence or a fallen roof did. It was the quiet, accumulating kind of wrong, the sort that didn't become a crisis until it all happened at once. She stood in the barn for a long time. Wyatt found her there when he came in to check on one of the mares. "Something wrong?" he said. "Yes," she said, because she'd decided early that honesty was the only currency she had here that was worth anything. She walked him through it, not quickly, not in a way designed to make him feel he'd done badly, just clearly. The hay placement, the feed storage, the wind seam, the condensation problem at the roofline. Wyatt listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend the way things had been done. He walked to each point as she indicated it, and he looked. And he was quiet, in a way that wasn't resistance, but was the particular silence of a man absorbing something he doesn't like, but can't argue with. When she was done, he said, "How long have these been problems?" "The hay placement, probably every wet season for however long you've been stacking it there. The feed storage, last 2 winters at minimum if you've had mice." She paused. "Have you had mice?" A beat. "Some. The roof condensation is newer, probably started when the board on the northeast corner cupped. You can see where the nail's starting to pull." He looked where she was pointing. He could see it. "My wife used to see things like that," he said. It wasn't a comparison. It was just a thing that came out of him before he decided whether to say it. Eliza didn't respond to it directly. She said, "I have ideas for fixing all of it, but I want to know what you can get material-wise before I lay out what it would cost you." "What would you need?" "Some scrap lumber and a way to raise the hay off the ground. Even 4 inches makes a difference. Something to fill the wind seam, which could just be caulk, and the right kind of rope if you haven't got board. And I need to look at the roof nail more carefully, but that might be a one-man job with a hammer if the board hasn't warped too far." Wyatt stood in the middle of the barn with his hands at his sides and looked around the space the way you look at something you've been close to for so long you stopped actually seeing it. "I've got scrap lumber in the back," he said finally. "Been meaning to use it for a new gate." "The gate can wait until spring," Eliza said. "The hay can't." He almost smiled. It wasn't much. A slight adjustment around his mouth. The kind that came and went before it could be called anything definitive. But it was there. "I'll show you where the lumber is," he said. They spent the better part of 2 days on the barn. Mason helped with the lumber. He had a good eye for measuring and the patience to cut to a line without rushing. And Wyatt worked alongside Eliza in a way that started as supervision and became, somewhere around the middle of the second day, something closer to partnership. He was stronger than her and faster with the heavier work. She was better at seeing the interconnected logic of the problems, the way one fix could create a new issue if you didn't account for it in advance. It wasn't smooth. There were points of friction. On the afternoon of the second day, she told him she wanted to add a ventilation gap along the upper east wall, a controlled opening that would let moisture out without letting cold drive straight in. She'd seen it done on a dairy operation in the county she'd grown up in, and it worked. "That's going to let the cold air in," Wyatt said. "Controlled cold air is better than trapped wet air," she said. "In a dairy barn, maybe." "In any barn," she said. "Dry cold doesn't rot hay. Damp does." He looked at the wall. He looked at her. "You have a way of being very certain about things," he said. Not unkindly, but pointedly. "I have a way of thinking through things before I say them," she said. "I know that can look like the same thing." A pause. "If it doesn't work," he said, "can you seal it back?" Yes. Then try it. She tried it. By the time they were done, the barn was not transformed. Nothing so dramatic as that. It was adjusted, improved by degrees. The hay was raised on a low platform of salvaged lumber. The feed sacks were moved to the inner wall. The wind seam was packed with rope caulking and would need proper sealing before the real cold came. The ventilation gap was cut and framed with a hinged shutter that could be closed in extreme weather and open in moderate cold. None of it was visible from outside the barn. No one who rode past the Holloway property would have seen a single change. But inside, the barn was now arranged to survive a Montana winter instead of just hoping to endure one. Word traveled in that valley the way it always does in places where people's lives are close enough to each other that other people's business becomes a form of local weather. By the end of Eliza's second week at Holloway Ranch, she was aware that she was being talked about. She knew because of the way the trader's wife looked at her when she went to the post with Wyatt to pick up the supply order. Not unfriendly, just curious in the measuring way that meant her name had come up in conversations she hadn't been present for. She knew because a neighboring rancher named Court Hale stopped by on the pretense of returning a borrowed tool and spent 20 minutes standing at the gate doing what was obviously an inspection of the property and its new arrangement, asking Wyatt questions that were aimed, with poor subtlety, at determining how the widow and her children had settled in. She knew because 2 days after that, a woman named Della Marsh arrived at the front of the property with a pie covered in cloth and the cheerful transparency of someone who had decided to do reconnaissance in the guise of neighborliness. Eliza made her coffee. They sat on the porch, and Della talked about the valley, who owned what, how the seasons ran out here, which families had been here long and which ones were newer. She talked about Wyatt's wife, Ruth, who had died of a fever 2 winters back, and about how the ranch had been different when she was alive, more settled, more of a place people stopped at. He closed off after she went, Della said. Can't blame him. They were a good match, Ruth and Wyatt. Not easy, either of them, but good. The kind of married that gets better as it goes. Eliza listened. She said, he mentioned her once. Briefly. Della looked at her with the careful interest of a woman who was very good at listening to what people didn't say. How is it being here? It's honest work, Eliza said. That's what I needed. Della nodded slowly. She picked up her coffee cup and looked out at the yard, where Clara was crouched near the barn door, studying something on the ground with that particular total focus. That little girl's going to be trouble in the best possible way, Della said. I know, Eliza said. She always has been. Della left the pie and rode back down the track, and Eliza stood on the porch and watched her go, and thought about the particular texture of community in a place like this, the way it held people, the way it watched them, the way the watching could be protection or pressure depending on which way it turned. She was aware that she existed here on provisional terms, that the ground under her arrangement with Wyatt had a quality of conditionality to it that she hadn't let herself think about directly, because thinking about it wouldn't help, and working would. But she wasn't naive enough to pretend the ground was solid. She was a woman with the disappeared husband and a debt cloud and 2 children, working on a widower's ranch by an arrangement that had no paper behind it. If Wyatt decided tomorrow that it wasn't working, they would be back on the road. She kept that in mind, not to scare herself, just to stay precise about what she was building and why. The problem with Gideon Voss didn't stay quiet. She'd expected him to let things settle. Men like Voss, in her experience, operated in waves. They applied pressure, waited to see what shifted, then came back when they'd decided on their next angle. She'd thought she had at least a month before the next one. She had 3 weeks. He came back on a Tuesday, just before noon, but this time he didn't come to the gate. He went directly to the trading post in town and made his move there, which was in some ways worse because it wasn't a conversation she could be present for. She found out from Mason. Mason had ridden in with Wyatt that morning to help load the supply order, and he was standing outside the post with the wagon while Wyatt was inside when Voss arrived with 2 other men. Voss hadn't seen Mason, or hadn't bothered to account for him, which was a different kind of not seeing. Mason came home and told her everything he'd heard. Voss had told Abe Finch, the trader, that the Vane woman's debt situation was more complicated than generally known, that Thomas Vane hadn't just left unpaid accounts. He'd borrowed against property he didn't have clear title to, and there was a legal question about whether those debts could attach to his wife under certain territorial provisions. He wasn't saying they would. He was just saying it was a question worth asking. just saying that anyone doing business with Holloway Ranch or extending credit there might want to be cautious given that situation. Eliza listened to Mason's account of this without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "How many people were in the trading post when he said this?" Mason thought. "Mr. Finch, the 2 men with Voss. One other man, I don't know him, came in from the back." "Did Wyatt hear it?" "Yes." "What did he say?" Mason was quiet for a moment. He didn't say anything right then. He finished paying for the order. Then on the way out, he stopped and told Mr. Voss that if he had legal questions, he should go talk to a lawyer and leave the trading post for trading. Eliza looked at her hands on the table. "Are you angry?" Mason asked. "Yes," she said. "But being angry at Gideon Voss is like being angry at bad weather. It doesn't change anything. What I need to think about is what can actually be changed." "What can be changed?" She looked at her son. He was 10 years old and asking the right question with the right kind of seriousness. She wanted to protect him from the complicated answer. She also knew that protecting him from it would be a way of protecting herself from having to say it out loud. "The debt," she said. "If I can find a way to clear what your father left, Voss loses his angle. You can't use a debt against someone who's paid it." "How much is it?" She had a number in her head. Rough, imprecise, built from memory, and the pieces she'd been able to learn before they'd lost the house. "More than I have," she said. "Less than it feels like." That was honest and incomplete, and Mason accepted it the way he accepted most things, by chewing on it quietly for a while and not pushing further until he'd worked out what he thought. That evening, Wyatt came to her in the kitchen after supper. He sat down at the table without his coffee, which was unusual. He sat with his hands flat on the table and he looked at her directly, which he didn't always do. "I heard what Voss said in town today," he said. "I know. Mason told me. I want to ask you something directly." "All right. Is there any truth to what he's suggesting? About the debt attaching to you under territorial law?" She held his gaze. "I don't know the specific legal question he raised. I know Thomas borrowed in ways he didn't tell me about. I know the debts exist. I don't know all of them. I know that I haven't been named in anything formally. I think because most of it was under his name, not jointly. But I can't tell you there's no risk because I don't have access to all of it." Wyatt was quiet. "That's a complicated answer," he said. "It's an honest one," she said. "I could give you a simpler one, but it would be less true." He looked at his hands. "If there's a legal action against you, if someone comes to this property with a claim, it affects the ranch." "I know that. And you're still here." "I'm still here because I have nowhere else that makes sense, and because I believe the work I'm doing is worth what you're giving me. But if you've decided that the risk isn't worth it, I'll understand that." The word "understand" sat between them. She meant it. She didn't want to mean it. Some part of her was very tired of understanding things that cost her. But she meant it. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not asking you to leave," he said. "I'm asking you to be straight with me. If something changes, if you hear something, learn something about what Thomas left behind, you tell me. Don't let me be the last one to know." "Agreed," she said. He pushed back from the table and stood. He was at the doorway when he turned back. "Voss isn't going to let this go easily," he said. "I know," Eliza said. "He wants the southeast pasture, and he wants me to feel like I need him. If I don't feel that way, he'll find a way to make the cost of having you here feel higher than the benefit." "What do you want me to do about that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Keep doing what you're doing," he said. "Make the benefit higher than the cost." He went upstairs. Eliza sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and thought about what that meant. Make the benefit higher than the cost. And she thought about the barn, and the hay platform, and the ventilation gap with its hinged shutter, and the porch step, and the pantry reorganization, and the harness repair, and all of the small, quiet work that nobody except Wyatt and the barn walls had witnessed. It wasn't enough. Not against Gideon Voss's particular kind of pressure, which worked on reputation and hesitation and the general human tendency to avoid complication. She needed something visible, something that couldn't be unseen or dismissed. She thought about the ranch, the whole shape of it, not just the barn. She'd been watching the land for 3 weeks now with the particular attention she brought to things she was trying to understand. She'd noticed things, patterns in how the wind moved across the property, The way the north slope held snow longer than the south. The angle at which water ran off after rain and where it pooled before it found the drainage line. The orientation of the barn relative to the prevailing winter winds, which was slightly off. Not wrong enough to be an obvious problem, but off enough that it created a drift pattern in the yard that would, in a hard winter, become genuinely obstructive. She started making notes. Not formal notes. She didn't have paper for that, or rather she didn't want to waste the paper she had. She made mental notes, the way she'd always organized complex things, by building a structure inside her head, placing each piece in relation to the others, turning the whole thing around until she could see it from all angles. By the end of October, she had a plan. Not the small-scale adjustments she'd been making. Something larger. Something that would change how the entire ranch sat inside the winter. She was aware it was a considerable thing to propose. She was also aware that proposing it and being dismissed was a risk she would have to take, because the alternative was keeping it to herself and watching the ranch spend another winter just barely surviving when it didn't have to. She waited until a Sunday evening when the week's work was behind them and the next week's hadn't started yet, the small pocket of time that existed between. Wyatt was on the porch. She brought coffee and sat, and for a few minutes they did what they'd started doing, which was sit together in the approximate quiet and not make it weird. Then she said, "I want to show you something." She'd drawn it in the dirt at the base of the porch steps. Not elaborate, just enough to make the geometry visible. The barn's position relative to the prevailing northwest wind, the natural drift path that formed as a result. The way you could reshape that drift, not by fighting it, but by placing barriers at the right angles to redirect where the snow accumulated. Angled wind barriers, she explained, not walls. Walls fought the wind and lost. Angles deflected it. You placed them strategically upstream of what you needed to protect, at roughly 30 to 45 degrees to the wind's primary direction, and you let the snow pile up on the far side where it did no harm, instead of against the barn doors and the cattle pens and the water trough. She also talked about the hay storage, a more ambitious version of what they'd done in the barn, with the possibility of building a separate elevated structure that was specifically oriented and ventilated for maximum preservation through a Montana winter. And the water trough positioning. The current position meant that the prevailing wind hit the open surface at full force, accelerating ice formation. Moving it 15 feet to the south, behind the natural wind shadow of the barn's east corner, would extend the time before it froze each morning. Wyatt listened to all of it. He was crouched at the bottom of the steps, looking at her dirt diagram with the same expression he'd had in the barn. Not resistance, not enthusiasm, but genuine absorption. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you learn to think about land this way?" he said. "My father," she said. "He was a farmer, not a rancher, but the problems aren't entirely different. He had a saying, 'You can't beat the land, you can only understand it well enough to work beside it.'" Wyatt looked at the diagram. "This is significant work," he said. "Time, materials." "Yes, and if it doesn't work the way you're thinking, we've spent resources we can't get back." "Yes," she said again. "Why would it work here if other ranches haven't done it?" "Some have," she said. "Farther north, where the winters are harder. It's not new thinking. It just hasn't come this far south yet because the winters here are survivable without it. You can get through a Montana winter the way this ranch has been set up. You just lose more than you have to." He was quiet for another long moment. "I'm not going to do all of it," he said. She'd expected that. "One section," he said, "but the south cattle pen. We'll put one of your angled barriers there and see what it does. If it works the way you say, we talk about the rest." One section, one test. She thought of the barn and the ventilation gap and the hinged shutter. "All right," she said. "And if it doesn't work," he said, "you take it apart yourself." "I'll take it apart myself," she said. He stood up, looked at the diagram in the dirt for one more moment, and went inside. Eliza looked at the diagram too. The angles were right. She was sure of that in the way you're sure of things when you've thought about them from every direction, and the logic doesn't change no matter which side you approach from. But sure wasn't the same as certain. Sure was what you had when the evidence pointed one way. Certain was what you had when the thing had already happened. She was not certain. The wind was already starting to come from the northwest with more intent than it had all autumn. The leaves on the cottonwood at the property's edge had been gone for a week. The ground in the mornings had that hard, faint frozen quality That meant the deep freeze was getting closer. She had time to build one barrier and find out what she was made of. Clara found her still on this porch. 20 minutes later and climbed into the chair beside her and didn't ask anything, just sat there with her shoulder against Eliza's arm in the way she did sometimes, not needing anything except the particular warmth of being close to someone. From the barn, they could hear Mason talking to the horses again. The same low murmur from the other night, patient and steady, carrying through the cooling air without words. Eliza put her arm around Clara and looked out at the land, her dirt diagram at her feet, the northwest wind moving through the dry grass at the edge of the property, the barn with its hinged shutter and its raised hay and its repacked windseam all quiet in the early dark. She had a plan, she had a test, she had a roof over 2 children's heads and coffee that was still warm, and a man inside who had said, "Keep doing what you're doing. It would have to be enough. She was going to make it enough." They built the wind barrier on a Thursday. It took most of the day, Eliza measuring and adjusting the angle twice before she was satisfied, Mason cutting the lumber while Wyatt set the posts. The posts had to go deep enough to hold against serious wind pressure, which meant working through the layer of partially frozen ground that had developed in the top 6 inches of soil. Wyatt handled that part without being asked, driving the posts with the heavy mallet while Eliza held the brace and called the angle. It was not graceful work. Her hands were cold before midday. She'd wrapped them in the strips of wool she'd cut from an old blanket, but the wool got damp from the post setting and lost most of its use by early afternoon. She kept working because stopping would mean admitting the cold was winning, and she was not prepared to do that in front of Wyatt or Mason or the general northwest wind, which had developed a personal quality she refused to acknowledge. By late afternoon, the barrier stood. It was not impressive to look at. That was the honest thing about it. A diagonal fence of rough lumber angled at 35 degrees to the prevailing wind direction, positioned upstream of the south cattle pen. It looked, to anyone unfamiliar with the logic behind it, like someone had started building a fence and then made a decision partway through that nobody had approved. Wyatt stood back and looked at it with his arms crossed. "It looks odd," he said. "It's supposed to redirect wind, not look nice," Eliza said. "It's going to look odd from the road. If it works the way I think, people can say it looks as odd as they want." He was quiet for a moment. "And if it doesn't work?" "Then I take it apart myself," she said. "We already agreed on that." He nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when he was filing something away rather than responding to it. The first real test came 11 days later, on a night when the temperature dropped faster than the almanac had suggested it would, and the wind shifted northwest with an edge that had ice in it before midnight. Eliza woke at 3 in the morning and lay still, listening. The whistle under the back door was different, sharper, more insistent, and the house was moving in the slight tonal way that solid structures move when wind is working against them. She got up. She pulled on her coat and boots and went outside, which was a decision she made before she'd fully reasoned through it, because the alternative was lying in bed not knowing. The cold hit her like a wall. Not the gradual cold of the past few weeks, but the serious kind. The kind the territory specialized in once it decided to stop hinting and start demonstrating. She crossed the yard to the south cattle pen, and she stood at the corner of the barrier and she looked. The snow that had fallen over the last 3 days, not heavy, but consistent, had drifted the way she'd calculated. The far side of the barrier had accumulated a substantial pile, angled and deep, exactly where she'd predicted the deflection would carry it. The near side of the pen, the side that in previous winters would have been buried against the fence posts and the cattle doors, was clear. Not swept clean clear, but workably clear. The difference between being able to open a gate in the morning and spending an hour digging one out. She stood in the serious cold for a few minutes and let herself look at it. Then she went back inside before she lost feeling in her feet. In the morning, Wyatt came down and went directly to the south pen the way she'd known he would. She watched from the kitchen window while he stood where she'd stood and looked at the drift pattern. I was out there for a while. When he came back in, he poured his coffee and sat down and said nothing for several minutes. Finally, he said, "The north pen drifted against the doors." "I know," Eliza said. "It always will until we put a barrier there too." Another silence. "The angling," he said. "You were within about 5 degrees of exactly right." "I know," she said again. He looked at her. "How?" he said. It was a genuine question, not skeptical, just genuinely wanting to understand the mechanism. I watched where the snow moved for 3 weeks before I drew the diagram, she said. The wind always comes from the same direction out here. It doesn't change much. So if you understand the direction and the obstacle, the drift pattern is predictable. It's not magic, it's just paying attention long enough. He drank his coffee. I want to do the North Pen, he said. I'd also recommend the water trough relocation, she said, before it gets any colder. We'll do both, he said. She kept her face neutral. She said, I'll draw the angles this morning. What followed was a week of building that changed the quality of the ranch in ways that were not visible from any road, but were felt in the daily work of running the place. The North Penn barrier went up in 2 days, faster than the first one, because Eliza and Mason had learned the rhythm of the process, and Wyatt had stopped second-guessing the angles. The water trough moved to the wind shadow of the barn's east corner on the 3rd day, which required resetting the drainage line and filling the old hole, which was more work than the move itself, but Wyatt did it without complaint. And then, as if the land was testing whether they'd earned it, the temperature dropped again, this time further and for longer. The second week of November brought cold that moved in stages. First the nights, then the midday hours, then the mornings when the thermometer outside the kitchen window read things that made Eliza recalculate her supply estimates. She'd been thinking of Montana winter as a known quantity. She'd grown up with hard winters, and she'd managed households through them. But this was something more determined. This was cold with ambition. The cattle needed more feed than she'd projected. The horses needed more water. Counterintuitive. Until you understood that cold made them drink less voluntarily, which meant you had to encourage water intake actively, or you'd lose condition on the animals faster than the cold alone would cause. She'd learned that from her father's operation, and she put it into practice here, adding warm water to the troughs twice a day at temperatures that encouraged drinking. Wyatt watched this without comment for 3 days before he asked where she'd learned it. Same place as the rest, she said. My father. He sounds like he knew what he was doing. He did, she said. He also went broke 3 times trying to do it, so knowing isn't everything. Something in Wyatt's expression shifted. Not quite a laugh, but the internal movement that a laugh makes before it decides whether to come out. No, he said, it isn't. Through all of this, Clara had been conducting her own separate enterprise. Eliza had been aware of it at the edges of her attention. Clara spending large portions of each afternoon in the barn, the particular concentrated way she moved through the yard on her way there, the occasional low sound of her voice carrying through the cold air. But it wasn't until a Wednesday in mid-November that she understood what Clara had been doing. The calf had been born late in October, the last of the season, which was already a problem because a late-season calf had less time to build strength before the real cold arrived. This one had come out small and had struggled to nurse from the first day. Wyatt had mentioned it once, briefly, in the tone of a man noting a likely loss without dwelling on it because dwelling on likely losses didn't change them. Clara had decided something different. She had, without telling anyone, been going to the barn twice a day to sit with the calf. She'd figured out that it would take warm milk from a bucket if the bucket was low enough and held steady enough, which required patience of a specific and demanding variety that most adults would have given up on after the first 2 days. She'd been persistent in the focused, unhurried way that children sometimes are with things they've decided matter. The calf had a white patch on its left shoulder that Clara had decided looked like a star. She called it Silver. Eliza found out about all of this when she went to the barn looking for Mason one afternoon and found Clara there instead, sitting cross-legged in the hay next to Silver, with her hand resting on the calf's side and talking in the quiet, even voice she used when she thought no one was listening. Eliza stood at the barn door for a moment before Clara heard her. He's eating better, Clara said, without embarrassment, as though Eliza had been part of the project all along. Eliza looked at the calf. It did look marginally better than the last time she'd seen it. More alert around the eyes, the muzzle less drawn. How long have you been doing this? Eliza asked. Since he was born, Clara said. Every day? Twice a day, morning and after the midday chores. Eliza sat down in the hay across from her daughter. The cold in the barn had a different texture than the cold outside, less moving, more settled. Silver turned his head toward Eliza with the mild, unconvinced interest of a young animal that was still deciding how many people it trusted. "Does Mr. Holloway know?" Eliza asked. "I think he knows," Claire said. "He was watching from the door one morning. He didn't say anything." Eliza thought about that. About Wyatt standing at the barn door watching a 7-year-old girl coax a failing calf with patient, unhurried attention and then going back to his work without saying anything. She thought about what that choice to say nothing probably meant. "Silver?" she said. "Because of the patch," Clara said. "I see it. Do you think he'll make it?" Eliza looked at the calf honestly. It was still small, still behind where it should be, but it was drinking, and it was alert, and it had Clara. "I think he has a better chance than he did," she said. Clara seemed to accept this as sufficient. She went back to resting her hand on Silver's side, and the calf did not move away. The complications with Gideon Voss did not resolve with the weather. Eliza had been hoping, or more precisely, she had been working with enough intensity that she hadn't had the mental space to worry, which was not the same as hoping, but produced a similar result, that Voss would direct his attention elsewhere as the winter settled in and the valley contracted into the business of surviving it. She was wrong about that. The second pressure came not through the trading post, but through a man named Silas Pruitt, who arrived at the property on a gray November afternoon and introduced himself as representing a land and property interest in the territory. He had papers. He was polite in the professional way that people are polite when they're about to say something that they know will be unwelcome. He asked to speak with Eliza specifically. Wyatt was in the barn. She had him called. They stood on the porch, the three of them, with the gray light coming flat off the low cloud cover and the wind moving at about the level where it wasn't a problem yet, but was reminding you it could be. Pruitt explained, in the careful language of someone who has rehearsed the explanation, that there were outstanding questions regarding the debt obligations of one Thomas Vane, formerly of Millhaven County, and that certain provisions of territorial property law allowed for a claim against a spouse under specific conditions. He had been engaged to investigate whether those conditions applied in this case. Eliza said, "Who engaged you?" Pruitt's politeness held. "I'm not at liberty to say." "Gideon Voss," Wyatt said. Not a question. Pruitt's politeness did not waver. "I'm not at liberty to say." "What specific conditions are you investigating?" Eliza asked. She kept her voice even. She had learned in the years with Thomas that panic was information you gave away to people who would use it, and she had no interest in giving Silas Pruitt anything useful. He outlined them. There were 3 potential conditions under which a wife's interest could be drawn into her husband's debt obligations in the territory. The first related to whether she had co-signed any agreements. The second related to whether she had materially benefited from funds obtained through those agreements. The third, the one that was clearly the hook, related to whether the debt had been secured against property in which she held a household interest. The house, in other words. The house they'd been put out of. "The house was taken by those creditors," Eliza said. "We were removed from it. We received nothing from its disposition." "I understand that's your account," Pruitt said. "It's what happened," she said. "I'm not disputing it. I'm investigating whether it can be documented." The particular ugliness of this, the way it turned her own dispossession into a question of whether she could prove it had happened, sat in Eliza's chest for a moment before she pushed it down to a place where it wouldn't interfere with the conversation. "What documentation would satisfy the investigation?" she said. Pruitt named several things. A written record from the creditors who had seized the property. Statements from anyone present at the removal. Any correspondence related to the debt that she might have in her possession. After he'd left, she and Wyatt stood on the porch, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Wyatt said, "Can you get those things?" "The creditors' records I'd have to request formally. The statements? Abe Finch was at the house when we left. He was buying back some of the furniture for resale. He saw us leave with what we carried." She paused. "As for correspondence, Thomas didn't leave any. He left the debts and took whatever paper trail there was." "Of course he did," Wyatt said, without inflection. "I'm going to need to go back to Millhaven," she said, "to the creditor's office, and I need to talk to Abe Finch." "I'll take you," he said. She looked at him. "It's 2 days' ride each way." "I know how far Millhaven is," he said. "The ranch, Mason can manage 2 days. He's been managing half of it already." She didn't argue, partly because he was right about Mason, partly because she was tired of navigating things alone, and the offer of someone willing to ride 4 days on her behalf was not something she was going to turn away out of misplaced pride. They went the following Monday. Mason was left with a list of tasks and the measured confidence of a boy who had been doing ranch work for 6 weeks and had developed the quiet competence that comes from learning from people who don't explain more than necessary because the work itself is the explanation. Clara was given charge of silver, which she accepted with the gravity of someone receiving an important commission. The ride to Millhaven was long and cold and not conversational in the way that some long rides become conversational when there's nothing to do but talk. Wyatt was not a man who talked to fill silence, and neither, when she was thinking hard about something, was Eliza. They rode alongside each other, and occasionally one of them said something practical about the road or the weather, and the other responded, and that was sufficient. What she was thinking about, most of the ride, was Thomas. Not with grief. That season had passed, or at least moved into a different room in her, with something closer to a forensic kind of anger, the specific to understand a system someone else had built and hidden, working backward from the damage to reconstruct what decisions had been made and when. Thomas had not been a cruel man. She thought that was important to say to herself, even now, even given everything. He'd been a weak one, not weak in the physical or even the practical sense. He was capable enough when the problem was in front of him, but weak in the particular way that made men avoid conversations they should have, put off decisions that needed making, borrow against a future they'd decided would be different without doing the work to make it different. He had borrowed money and told himself it would be fine because the next season would be better. It hadn't been better. He had borrowed more. He had not told her. She had found out the way you find out things people don't tell you, through the appearance at the door of people with papers, at a moment when there was nothing left to fix. What made her angry, when she let herself feel the full shape of it, was not the debt. Debt was a fact, a condition, something you could in theory work through if you knew the extent of it. What made her angry was the not telling. The years of her life she'd spent managing a household with information that had been curated to protect her from the truth, which in practice meant protecting him from the conversation. She had deserved this conversation. She'd never gotten it. Millhaven in November was smaller than she remembered it, which was the thing that happened when you left a place under significant pressure. It grew in your memory to match the size of the problem it represented, and then you returned and found it was just a town. The creditor's office was a back room at the land broker's office on the main street. She'd been in it once before, on the morning they were put out. It had smelled of coal smoke and old paper then, and it smelled of those same things now. The broker, a man named Cassidy, who had the quality of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it no longer registered as anything other than procedure, looked at her with the slight surprise of a man who had not expected to see her again. "Mrs. Vane," he said. "Mr. Cassidy," she said, "I need a formal record of the property disposition. Specifically, what was recovered from the property, what value was assigned to the furniture and contents, and whether there is any remaining claim against the household." Cassidy looked at Wyatt, who was standing slightly behind and to the side of Eliza, and then back at Eliza. "That's a formal records request," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm making it formally." It took an hour and produced 3 pages of documentation that confirmed what she'd told Pruitt. The house contents had been sold, the property had cleared most of the outstanding balance, and there was a remaining amount of $31 against Thomas Vane's name, not against hers. $31. She looked at that number for a long moment. She had $9.40. She'd been saving from the small cash transactions Wyatt had given her. Not wages, but the occasional payment for goods she'd made or preserved that he'd sold or traded in town. $9.40 over 7 weeks of work. She was $22 short. Wyatt, reading the paper over her shoulder, said, "I'll cover the rest." She turned. "No," she said. "Eliza." "No," she said again. "This is Thomas's debt. It goes against him. And clearing it is something I do myself, or it doesn't mean what I need it to mean." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. He did not argue. That was one of the things she'd learned about him. He disagreed sometimes, stated his disagreement once with directness, and then let the other person's decision stand. "Then you need $22 more," he said. "Yes," she said. "By when?" She looked at Cassidy. "How long before Voss's investigation becomes a formal claim?" Cassidy had the look of a man who knew more about this than he was required to say. "These things move slowly. he said carefully. A formal filing would give you 30 days to respond. Has a filing been made? A pause. Not yet. She thought about the timeline. Winter was deepening. The ranch work was heaviest in these months because the weather demanded constant attention. There were limited opportunities to earn outside the ranch. I have work to do, she said. It was not to Cassidy. It was to herself, or to Wyatt, or to the general shape of a situation that was going to require her to find $22 in a Montana winter. They went to see Abe Finch next. The trader listened to what she needed and agreed without ceremony. He had been at the house the morning they left. He had seen Eliza and the children walk out with a blanket and a bundle. He stated this willingness to put in writing with the matter-of-fact directness of a man who considered lying to be a waste of everyone's time. Voss came in here and ran his mouth, Abe said, while he was writing. I've known Gideon Voss for 20 years. He's the kind of man who'd buy a widow's reign and then sell it back to her. He signed the statement without looking up. That's for what it's worth. Eliza folded the statement carefully. It's worth quite a bit, she said. On the ride back, the second afternoon when the light was going gray and the road was quiet and cold, Wyatt said, You make things hard for yourself. I know, she said. Not saying it's wrong, he said, just saying I've noticed it. She thought about how to respond to that. She decided on honesty, which was what she always decided on when she took more than a moment to decide. I had someone make things easy for me once, she said. He made them easy by not telling me how hard they actually were. I'd rather know the weight of a thing and carry it myself than have someone carry it for me without telling me it existed. The horses' hooves on the frozen road made a sound that was different from the sound they made in warm months. Denser, less absorbed. Wyatt said, That's a fair way to be. It's also exhausting, she said, which surprised her a little, the admission of it. He looked over at her, not with pity, with the particular look of someone who recognized something. Yes, he said. It is. They got back to the ranch as the last light was failing. Mason had kept everything running. The animals were fed, the water troughs had been checked twice, and he had, on his own initiative, repacked a section of the wind seam on the barn's south wall that had started to work loose. He told this to Eliza with the careful understatement of a boy trying not to seem proud, which meant he was very proud. Good, she said. You saw it needed doing. It wasn't hard to see, he said. Most things aren't hard to see, she said. They're hard to look at long enough. Silver was still alive. Clara reported this with the statistical confidence of someone who had ceased to consider the alternative seriously. Silver was eating. Silver had learned to take the bucket without Clara holding it steady. Silver had, that very afternoon, stood up on his own without assistance for the first time since the cold had deepened. These were presented as facts of considerable importance. Wyatt, who had come in for supper and heard the Silver report while hanging up his coat, said, She's going to be all right, that calf. Clara looked at him directly. I know, she said. He looked back at her with something that had no name Eliza could put to it exactly. The expression of a man being shown something he'd forgotten existed. Eliza made supper. It was a simple one, beans and the last of the cured pork from the cellar with the cornbread she'd gotten efficient at in the weeks since they arrived. She put it on the table without ceremony, and they ate the way they'd been eating for 7 weeks now, the 4 of them, with the particular sound of people who had gotten used to each other's silences. After, while she was at the basin, she thought about the $22. She had things she could make and sell. The mending and alterations she'd been doing for the neighboring ranch wives when they brought work by. The preserves she'd put up in October from the late-season produce. The 2 hooked rugs she'd been working on in the evenings from the unraveled wool of an old blanket. She had skills, and she had time, at least the narrow margins of time between the ranch work's demands. She could get there. It would take until March, maybe April. She had to hope that Voss moved slowly and that Cassidy's not yet held for long enough. The night was deep into cold by the time she came out of the kitchen. The fire in the main room was banked low. Mason was already in the loft. Clara was asleep in the narrow room, her breathing slow and even. Eliza stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the yard. The wind barrier at the south pen was just visible in the darkness, a shadow at an angle, doing its work in the cold without anyone watching it. Beyond it, the sky was very dark and very clear, The way it got out here when the clouds cleared after cold came through. The kind of sky that looked like something had been very recently cleaned. She'd been here 7 weeks. She had Pruitt's investigation behind her, Voss's patience ahead of her, $22 between her and the end of a chapter she needed to close. And the barn had stayed dry through 2 temperature drops and 1 serious wind event, and the South Penn's gate had been opened every morning without digging, and Silver was standing on his own, and Mason had noticed a failing wind seam and repacked it without being asked. She held those things carefully, the way you hold things that are true and good when the things that are difficult are louder. Then something happened that she had not anticipated. Not Voss, not the debt, not the weather. She had gone to the barn to check that the lamp was out, a habit she'd developed, the last check of the night, when she noticed the smell. It was faint at first. She almost walked past it, but something made her stop just inside the door and breathe carefully. Hay. But not the clean, dry smell of properly stored hay. Something underneath it. Something with a faint warmth to it that didn't belong in a cold barn on a cold night. She held the lamp up. The haystack on the north wall. The section she hadn't raised yet. The section that was still on the floor because she'd run out of lumber. Had been sealed along the top edge by a canvas tarp she'd pulled over it 2 weeks ago to protect it from the roof condensation she hadn't fully solved. She'd sealed it too well. Well, the moisture hadn't escaped. It had stayed inside, working down through the stack. The bottom layer was heating from within. The particular internal heat that wet, compressed organic matter produces when it begins to break down. The same heat that, if left unaddressed, would move through the entire stack within days and destroy every bale it touched before anyone smelled it from outside the barn. She stood very still for a moment. She understood exactly what she was looking at. She also understood that it was her mistake. The canvas was her decision. She'd put it there to solve one problem, and in doing so had created another. The logic had been sound, keep the drip off the hay, but the execution had been wrong. She hadn't left enough gap at the edge. She hadn't checked the moisture content beneath it. She'd been moving too fast. She stood there in the cold barn with the lamp and the faint, wrong warmth rising from the north stack, and she let herself understand the full weight of what she was looking at. Their entire winter feed was in this barn. The damaged stack was approximately 1/3 of the total supply. She walked to the house and knocked on Wyatt's door. She heard him move, the particular sound of a man going from asleep to awake faster than most people can. The habit of ranchers who know that being called in the night is rarely for good news. He opened the door. He read her face before she spoke. "What is it?" "The barn," she said. "North stack. Come and look." He came. He looked. He stood over the stack the same way she had, breathing carefully, understanding the same sequence of things she'd understood. He looked at her. She said it before he could ask the question. "It was the canvas. My decision. I sealed it wrong." He didn't argue that. He didn't reassure her either. He just said, "How bad?" "We need to open it tonight and see," she said. "If the heat hasn't reached the middle of the stack yet, we can save most of it. If it has—" She didn't finish. They both knew what the end of that sentence was. "What do we do?" he said. She looked at the stack. She had 2 options, and they were not equally good. She could try to save it, pull back the canvas, open the barn for ventilation, attempt to separate the affected layers and dry them enough to arrest the damage. It was possible. If the heat hadn't gone too deep, it was possible. Or she could take it apart completely. Move the whole stack, separate every bale, dry what could be dried, and cut the losses on what couldn't. The first option was faster and risked losing everything if she'd misjudged the damage depth. The second option was slower and would cost them 3 days of brutal cold work, but would give her information, would tell her exactly what she was dealing with instead of guessing at it. "We take it apart," she said. Wyatt looked at the stack. "That's 3 days," he said. "I know. In this cold." "I know," she said. "But if we try to save it and I'm wrong about the depth, we lose the winter feed. If we take it apart, we lose 3 days." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. They started that night by lamplight, in the serious cold of the barn, with their breath-making shapes in the air and the work being exactly as hard as she'd known it would be. She didn't ask Mason to help until morning. She let him sleep. But through the night, it was her and Wyatt in the barn, moving bales, separating layers, checking the heat depth of each section. Neither of them said anything that wasn't necessary to the work. Around 2 in the morning, when they'd cleared half the stack and the damage was becoming visible, about a quarter of the section was actively compromised, worse than she'd hoped. Not as bad as her worst case. Wyatt stopped and stood with his hands on his knees for a moment, catching his breath. He looked at her. She said, before he could say anything else, "I know. It was my mistake." "I wasn't going to say that," he said. "What were you going to say?" He straightened up. "I was going to say that you called it tonight," he said. "The smell. Most people would have walked past it." She looked at the damaged bales stacked to the side. "I should have checked under the canvas 3 days ago." "Yes," he said. "You should have." He picked up the next bale. "But you didn't walk past it tonight. That matters too." They worked until the light came. They finished dismantling the north stack as the gray winter light came through the barn's east gap, thin and cold, and without much promise of warmth. Mason arrived at first light and understood the situation without needing it explained. He read it in the separated bales, the damaged piles set apart from the salvageable ones, the particular quality of his mother's face after a night of physical work and held down worry. He didn't ask questions. He picked up where they'd left off and worked through the morning with the steady, head-down efficiency he'd been developing since the first week. Of the north stack, they saved roughly 60%. It was better than Eliza had feared at 2 in the morning when the damage had looked, in the lamplight, like it might be worse. But 60% of a third of the winter supply was still a gap, and gaps in winter feed had consequences that ran in a straight line from cause to effect. Less feed meant less condition on the cattle. Less condition meant lower weight come spring. Lower weight meant less value at market. She did the arithmetic in her head, and it came out to a number she didn't like. Wyatt did the same arithmetic, she suspected, because he spent the better part of that first day after the barn work with the particular quiet of a man recalculating. He wasn't angry with her. He'd said what he'd said in the barn at 2 in the morning, and he was not a man who said things twice just to have said them more. But he was thinking, and the thinking had weight to it. She let him think. She went about the day's work and she thought her own version of the same problem from a different angle. The question was not whether the loss had happened. It had. The question was what you did with a winter feed gap when there were still 3 months of serious cold ahead and you couldn't undo what had damaged the stack. By the end of that first day, she had the beginning of an answer. Wyatt was in the barn doing the evening animal check when she came in and stood near the door with her arms crossed, not defensively, just against the cold, and said, "I have an idea about the feed." He looked at her from across the barn. "Court Hale," she said. "His south pasture is protected and he keeps a larger hay surplus than he needs. He mentioned it the day he came to inspect the property. He said it almost as an aside, but he said it." "Hale would want something in return," Wyatt said. "Yes," she said. "But he's been watching our barn modifications with more interest than he pretends. He came by twice in November on thin pretexts." She paused. "I think he'd trade surplus feed for the plans and help implementing the wind barriers on his property." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "You'd give him what we built here?" "I'd help him build it," she said. "The knowledge isn't a thing that gets used up by sharing it." He thought about that. "He might also just take the plans and use them without giving us anything," he said. "He might," she said, "but he's a practical man, not a dishonest one. And the value in what I'm offering isn't the drawings. It's knowing where to put the angles. That's not something you can lift off a piece of paper and apply correctly without understanding why." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "You want to ride out to Hale's tomorrow?" he said. "If you'll come with me," she said. "I'll come with you," he said. Court Hale was a leathery man in his 60s who had been ranching this valley since before most of the current population had arrived, and he had the quality of someone who'd seen enough schemes and proposals and grand ideas fail that his default response to any new proposition was a slow, skeptical quiet that required you to fill it with more than enthusiasm. Eliza had prepared for this. She did not start with the trade proposal. She started with the South cattle pen, asked if she could look at it, asked how the drift had been running this winter. Hale walked her out to it with the wariness of someone who suspected they were being managed but couldn't identify the mechanism yet. She looked at his south pen for about 3 minutes. "Your main drift problem is coming off that ridge," she said, pointing north-northeast. "The wind hits the ridge at that angle and deflects down, which means the snow isn't coming in from the northwest the way it looks like it should. It's actually hitting you from about 15 degrees east of northwest by the time it reaches the pen. That's why your current break isn't doing what you thought it would do. Hale looked at the ridge, looked back at her. I put that break in 4 years ago, he said. I know, she said, and it would work perfectly if the wind came straight from the northwest. But the ridge changes the angle. You need the barrier about 20 degrees further east than where you have it. He was quiet. You can check it, she said. Watch where the snow piles after the next wind event. If I'm right, the heaviest drift will be on the east side of the pen, not the north. He looked at the pen. What do you want for this? He said. Feed, she said. Hey, we had a storage problem and we're carrying a gap into the second half of winter. I'll help you reposition the barrier and add 2 more, one at the water trough, one at the north entrance to the barn, and I want a fair weight of your surplus in return. Hale looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked back at him with the expression of a man who had decided to let the conversation happen without inserting himself into it. She talk like this all the time? Hale said. Generally, Wyatt said. Hale looked back at Eliza. How much feed? He said. They negotiated for 20 minutes. It was not an unpleasant negotiation. Hale was direct and Eliza was direct, and neither of them inflated their position beyond what they actually needed, which made the whole thing faster than it might have been with other people. They settled on a number that would close roughly 2/3 of the gap Eliza had calculated. When? Hale asked. 2 days, she said. I'll come with my son. It'll take the better part of a day to reposition the barrier and install the others. Hale nodded. On the ride back, Wyatt said, 2/3 of the gap. I know, she said. The other third? I've been thinking about that too. The back pasture grass is dormant, but it's still there. If we rotate the cattle through it more actively in December instead of keeping them on the primary pasture, we can reduce the daily hay requirement by about 15%. It won't close the gap completely, but combined with the Hale feed, it gets us close enough. Wyatt rode in silence for a moment. You worked that out before we got to Hale's, he said. It wasn't a question. I worked it out last night, she said, while I was finishing the stack. He shook his head once, not in disagreement, but in the way people move their heads when they're absorbing something that keeps being larger than they expect. They returned to a ranch that was being actively watched. She'd been aware of the watching for weeks, but it had increased in intensity since the Pruitt visit, and it increased again in the days following the Hale negotiation, because word moved through a valley like that the way water found its level, not by announcing itself, but by finding every low place and filling it. Delamarche came by again, this time with purpose rather than pie. She sat at the kitchen table with Eliza and said, with the directness of a woman who had decided to stop being subtle, You should know that Voss has been talking to people about the debt situation, not just Finch and Pruitt. He went to the land registry office in Harker County. What did he find? Eliza said. I don't know exactly, but he's still looking, which means he hasn't found what he needs yet. Della wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. He's not going to stop, Eliza. He wants Wyatt in a position where he needs Voss for something. The water rights, the pasture sale, something. And you being here is making Wyatt less vulnerable to that, not more. Eliza looked at her. He's not doing this because of your husband's debts, Della said. That's just the tool. He's doing it because Wyatt hasn't needed him in 2 years, and that bothers a man like Voss considerably. I know, Eliza said. Della looked at her carefully. Do you have a plan? I have a partial plan, Eliza said. The legal piece I can close if I can get the money together. The rest of it, she paused. The rest of it is about whether this winter goes well enough that Voss doesn't have anything to point at. Della nodded slowly. Outside, the wind had picked up again. It moved through the gap under the back door with the whistle Eliza had by now come to know, as well as anything in this house. The whole valley's watching, Della said. You know that. I know, Eliza said. Some of them are hoping you prove him wrong, Della said. More than you'd expect. She left the coffee cup on the table and rode home into the gray afternoon, and Eliza sat for a moment in the quiet she left behind. The whole valley's watching. She'd been aware of it as an abstraction. Hearing it stated made it specific and solid, the way things that exist in the air become heavier when they find words. She went back to work. The Hale job took a day and a half, longer than she'd said, not by failure, but by the discovery that one of his posts had rotted at the base and needed replacing before the barrier could go on it. She and Mason worked through the cold without complaint because the work was straightforward and the arithmetic at the end of it was clear. Hale watched them work with the careful attention of a man learning something he intended to use, which was fine. She'd expected that. She explained what she was doing as she went. Not teaching in a formal sense, just narrating the reasoning, which was the way her father had taught her, and which she'd found was how people actually absorbed things. Hale's hired man, a quiet Swede named Bergstrom, who communicated primarily in short declarative statements and had an almost architectural eye for plumb and level, turned out to be extremely useful. By mid-afternoon, the three of them had a working rhythm. Mason, she noticed, watched Bergstrom specifically. Watched the way he held the post brace, the economy of his movements, the way he set a level and trusted it. On the ride home, Mason said, "That man's good at knowing when something's straight." He is, Eliza said. "How do you get that way?" "By being wrong about it enough times that you stop trusting your eye and start trusting the level," she said. Mason thought about this for a while. "Is that true for everything?" he said. She thought about Thomas and the house, and the debts she hadn't known about until the house was gone. "Most things," she said. The feed arrived at Holloway Ranch 2 days after the Hale job, loaded in 2 of Hale's wagons. Wyatt and Mason unloaded it into the barn with the efficient focus of people who understood exactly what the weight of this supply represented, and Eliza recalculated her numbers and found that with the pasture rotation strategy they would come through the winter within acceptable margins. Not comfortably. There was no comfort in it, but inside the margins. That night she allowed herself the small, private acknowledgement that the crisis she'd caused with the canvas and the sealed stack was, if not fully repaired, then managed. You couldn't undo a mistake. You could build forward from it well enough that the forward was what defined you, not the mistake itself. She wasn't certain she'd built far enough forward yet, but she was building. Then December arrived and decided to make its intentions clear early. The first serious cold system of the year came through on a Wednesday in early December, and it was not subtle about it. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 6 hours. Eliza watched it happen on the thermometer outside the kitchen window, the mercury sinking in a way that felt deliberate, like something with a destination in mind. The sky went from gray to white to a specific shade of pewter that ranchers in the valley recognized as the particular color the sky turned before it stopped being a sky and started being a thing you had to survive. The wind shifted northwest and built through the afternoon. By nightfall it was serious. Not a blizzard? Not yet. But the kind of pre-blizzard weather that came ahead of a blizzard, the way silence sometimes came before a very loud sound. Everything slowed down and tightened up, and the air had a quality that made you careful without quite knowing why. Wyatt went up on the barn roof to check the board she'd identified weeks ago, the one with the pulling nail, the one that had been on her list since the beginning and kept getting moved back as more urgent things replaced it. In a serious wind event, a loose board on the barn roof was not a deferred maintenance problem. It was an active risk. He went up in the early afternoon while the wind was still manageable. He found 2 boards, not one. The second one had loosened recently. She'd checked it in October and it had been holding, but the cold cycles of November had worked the nail further. She was in the yard below him, passing up the lumber brace he'd asked for, when she heard the sound. It was not a dramatic sound. It was the particular sound of a man's boot losing its grip on a frost-slicked surface, a short, sharp scrape, followed by a heavier sound that meant he'd come down on the roof boards instead of staying upright. She looked up. Wyatt was sitting on the roof, not standing. His right leg was at an angle that told her something was wrong before he said anything. "Don't move," she said. "I'm not planning to," he said. His voice was controlled but tighter than usual. She got the ladder repositioned and went up. His ankle had twisted badly against the edge of the roof board. Not broken, she thought, but badly enough that the boot would need to come off quickly before the swelling made that harder. She helped him down the ladder with the careful attention of someone who understood that rushing would make this worse, not better, and the roof could wait. Inside, she got the boot off before the swelling could trap it. The ankle was bad, already thickening, the tissue around it going the particular colors that meant a serious sprain and possibly something worse. She wrapped it tight with the strips of cloth she kept for exactly this kind of thing, elevated it on the bench, and told him to stay there. "The roof," he started. "I'll finish the roof," she said. Eliza, the wind's picking up. I know what the wind is doing, she said. I can see the weather from up there the same as you could. Stay off this ankle. He looked at her. She had already picked up his coat and was putting it on over her own. Take Mason, he said. Mason will hand me things from below, she said. That's all I need. She went back up. The wind by now had real intention in it. She could feel it working at the edges of the roof, testing the boards, finding the loose ones with the particular intelligence that serious wind has for weakness. She moved carefully, much more carefully than she normally moved, because she was aware that she was on a frost-slicked roof in building wind and that falling would be a different kind of problem than the one Wyatt had just had. The two boards were nailed back in 20 minutes. She didn't rush them and she didn't cut corners. She set each nail properly, checked the boards against the crossbeam, checked them again. When she came down, Mason looked at her face. You all right? He said. Fine, she said. Get inside. The storm built through the night. By midnight, it was the kind of wind that you didn't need to check a thermometer to understand. You felt it in the bones of the house, heard it in the way the barn's walls spoke back to it, felt it in the particular cold that came under the back door, even with the caulk she'd packed in there in October. Eliza was up at intervals through the night, not because she could do anything in the dark with the wind at that level, but because sleeping through a storm of that size was something she hadn't quite learned to do. At 2 in the morning, she pulled on her coat and went to the window and looked out at what the wind was doing. The South Penn barrier was visible in the dark because the snow had piled high against its far side, the deflection side, and the pale mass of it caught what little light there was. The pen itself, on the near side, looked clear. She looked at the North Penn. The North barrier, the second one they'd built, was doing the same thing. Both of them were working, in the dark, in the serious wind, without anyone watching. She stood at the window for a while. Then she heard something that wasn't the house or the wind. She heard it again and identified it, cattle, from the direction of the south pasture. Not the normal low sound that cattle made at night, but something more urgent, more compressed. She went to the barn side window. In the darkness she could see, or more precisely, she could sense, the way you sense mass in the dark when there's enough of it, that the snow was behaving wrong on the south side of the property. The drift was not going where the barrier should have sent it. She lit the lamp and looked harder. The problem became clear in the lamp's limited range. The storm was bigger than any of the weather events the barriers had been tested against. The wind was not coming from its usual angle. It had shifted just slightly in a way that the extraordinary conditions of a serious blizzard sometimes produced, and the shift was creating a different drift pattern. The snow was piling not on the far side of the south barrier but partially around it, building toward the fence line of the south pasture. If it continued at this rate through the night, by morning the fence would be buried, and the cattle, confused by the storm and drawn to the fence line for shelter, would be trapped against a wall of snow that would reduce their air and their movement to dangerous levels. She looked at this situation for a moment. She understood it the way she understood the barn at 2 in the morning, with the wrong warmth rising from the hay, completely, quickly, with the clarity that came from having thought about these systems long enough that the problems announced themselves. The question was what to do about it. She went upstairs. She knocked on Wyatt's door. He was already awake. She'd heard him moving when she came up the stairs. "What is it?" he said. She described what she'd seen, the drift pattern, the fence line, the cattle. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking through it. "The wind shift is making the barrier work wrong," he said. "Partially wrong," she said. "It's still deflecting the main force, but the angle change means the secondary drift is going to the fence instead of the open field. Can you reposition the barrier in this wind?" "No," she said. "That's not the option." He waited. "We open the fence," she said. A pause. What?" he said. "The south pasture fence line, the southeast section where the drift is building. We cut it open. We let the cattle move east into the back pasture away from the accumulation. The drift builds against the barrier and the fence posts, but not against the animals." Another pause. Longer. "That fence keeps the cattle in during spring melt when the east boundary floods," he said. "I know. If we cut it, we lose the integrity of that line. We can't get it repaired until the thaw, which means 3 months of a different management approach." "I know," she said, "but if the drift builds to full height against that fence line through the night, with the cattle pressed against it, we lose animals. Not maybe. That's what happens." He was quiet. She said, "You can tell me I'm wrong. You know this land better than I do. If you think the drift won't get that high, tell me and I'll trust your read." Another silence. This one felt different. Not deliberation, but a man checking his own knowledge against a situation he was seeing clearly for the first time. "It'll get that high," he said. "Maybe higher." "Then we cut the fence." "Who goes out in this?" he said. It was not a protest. It was a practical question, and she heard in it that he was not going anywhere on that ankle. "Mason and I," she said. He was quiet again. "He's 10, he said. "He's a careful 10, she said, "and I need someone to hold the line while I work the fence. I'm not going to send him to do anything I'm not standing next to him for." A long pause. "Wake him," Wyatt said. "Make sure he's layered properly." She went to the barn loft. Mason was awake. She suspected he'd been awake for a while, so he had his father's quality of lying still when he was listening to something. He sat up when she came in with the lamp, and she saw on his face that he'd already been tracking the storm sounds. She told him what needed doing. She told him exactly, without softening it. "This is the situation. This is the risk. This is what I'm going to do, and what I need you to do." He listened. He said, "How do we find the fence in this?" "We rope to the barn corner and walk it," she said. "The barn corner is 30 feet from the fence line. If we keep the rope taut, we can't lose the direction." He nodded. He was already pulling on his second pair of socks. They roped to the barn corner. The wind outside was a physical thing, not a weather condition, but an opponent, something with weight and direction that pushed against them in a way that made walking a constant recalibration. Eliza kept the rope in her left hand and the wire cutters in her right and moved steadily toward the fence, Mason behind her with his hand on her shoulder because the wind made it hard to stay parallel. The fence appeared out of the storm, and the drift against it was already high, higher than she'd seen from the window, the snow packed dense against the posts, the lower wire barely visible. She found the southeast section and cut. Not one wire. 3, top, middle, bottom, cut, and folded back so the opening was wide enough for the cattle to move through without panicking. She cut a second section 12 feet east of the first for the same reason. The work was hard in the cold with the wind fighting her at every wire. The cutters were heavy, and her hands were cold enough that the grip had gone from effective to barely adequate by the time she was through the third wire on the second opening. But she got through it. Then they stood back. Nothing moved at first. The cattle were huddled at the far side of the pen, pressed together for warmth, and the blizzard between Eliza and them was too opaque to see through. She couldn't go in after them, not with the visibility at this level. She waited. Mason stood beside her with his shoulder against her arm, exactly the way Clara did on the porch, and neither of them said anything. Then, movement. A shape in the white. Then another. The cattle were moving east, not in a rush, but in the slow, reluctant way that animals move when they trust the direction, but not the conditions. One by one, they came through the gap, felt the slightly less obstructed route to the back pasture, and kept going. She counted what she could see. When the movement stopped, she thought most of them had come through. Not certain, but most. They roped back to the barn. Inside, out of the wind, the silence was the specific silence of a storm that is still happening but can no longer reach you directly. Mason's face was red from the cold, and he was breathing through his mouth the way you breathe when you've been working against wind. He sat down on the hay and leaned back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. "That was cold," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are they going to be okay? The cattle?" "The back pasture has the natural ridge on the north side," she said. "They'll drift south against it, and the ridge will give them some shelter. It's not good, but it's better than the fence." He was quiet for a moment. "You knew what to do," he said. She sat down next to him. Her hands were aching now that she was out of the wind. The particular deep ache of cold that had been kept at bay by necessity and was now catching up. "I knew what the problem was," she said. "That's different from knowing what to do. There were 2 options and neither of them was good. I picked the one that was less bad." "How do you know which one is less bad?" She thought about the question. It was a real one. "You look at what each choice protects and what each choice costs," she said. "The fence can be repaired in spring. The cattle can't be." He was quiet again, absorbing this. They went back inside. Wyatt was at the base of the stairs, not sitting. He'd been standing there on the bad ankle for who knew how long. He looked at them. Looked at the color of their faces, which told him most of what he needed to know about what the outside had been like. "Done?" he said. "2 openings," she said. "Southeast section. Most of them came through." He let out a slow breath. "Sit down," she said. "You shouldn't be on that ankle." "I'm aware of that," he said. "Then why are you standing in the hallway at 3 in the morning?" He looked at her for a moment. "I was listening," he said. It was a simple statement, and she understood what it contained. The particular helplessness of a man who couldn't do the thing that needed doing and was standing as close as he could get to the place where someone else was doing it. She said, "We're back." He nodded. He went back to the kitchen, and she followed, and she put the kettle on because they were both cold enough that something hot was not optional. Mason went upstairs without being told. They sat at the kitchen table with the storm still running at full force outside, the windows showing nothing but dark and white, and the house holding around them in the way solid things hold in serious wind, not comfortable, not quiet, but holding. Wyatt said, "The fence." "Spring repair," she said. "It'll need 3 new posts and about 40 feet of wire. The posts might be a problem if the ground is still partly frozen in early April, but we can work around it." He looked at his coffee cup. "You cut the fence," he said. "Every instinct says you protect the fence." "Every instinct says the wrong thing sometimes," she said. He was quiet. "You don't fight the wind," he said. It was almost to himself. "You understand where it wants to go," she said, "and you get out of its way. Or in this case, you get the cattle out of its way." The storm went on through the night and into the following morning, and by the time the light came, thin and white and exhausted looking, the worst of it had passed. Wyatt's ankle kept him inside, which he accepted with the particular controlled frustration of a man who knew the situation was not negotiable and hadn't stopped being unhappy about it. Eliza and Mason went out at first light to assess what the storm had left behind. The South Penn's fence was buried, exactly as she'd predicted. The posts barely visible at their tops, the wire invisible under packed snow. The drift on the far side of the south barrier was the largest accumulation she'd seen yet, taller than Mason at its peak, a hard white wall of exactly the kind of weight that would have been catastrophic against the cattle pen. The barrier had worked. Imperfectly. The wind shift had changed the drift geometry, but the bulk of the force had still been redirected. What had reached the fence had been the secondary effect, not the primary impact. She looked at the barrier for a moment and thought about this distinction. The primary impact redirected. The secondary effect still caused damage. The answer had been to address the secondary effect differently when she recognized it, not to pretend the barrier had failed. The cattle were in the back pasture. She found them against the north ridge exactly where she'd told Mason they would go, compressed together in the way cattle compress in cold. Some of them looking thoroughly unhappy, all of them alive. She counted them twice. 1 missing. She went through the back pasture with Mason and found the missing animal, a young steer, at the east corner of the back fence, alone, moving with the stiffness of an animal that had been cold and stationary too long. Not injured, just cold and separated. They drove him back toward the herd. He went without much argument, which meant he was tired enough to want what the herd was offering. When they got back to the house, Gideon Voss was standing in the yard. He was not alone. He'd brought the man from the land registry. Not Pruitt this time, a different man, younger, with a case of papers under his arm and the look of someone who had been told to be here and would rather be anywhere else. Voss looked at Eliza. He looked at the south pen, buried to its posts. He looked at the north pen, which was in better shape. The barrier there had worked more cleanly because the wind shift had actually improved its angle, a piece of luck she hadn't anticipated but would accept. He looked at the barn, standing intact. He looked at the cattle visible in the back pasture, alive, accounted for, standing in the cold with the battered but functional quality of animals that had survived a hard night. The man with the papers said something quietly to Voss. Voss said, "This is a formal inquiry regarding the outstanding—" "I heard what it is," Wyatt said from the porch. Eliza hadn't heard him come out. I was standing on the porch with his weight on his left foot and his right hand on the porch rail, the ankle wrapped, and his face had the quality it had the day he'd told Voss to come back without the rest of it. Flat and final, the expression of a man who had reached the end of a specific patience. "Timing's interesting," Wyatt said. "Night of the worst storm of the year, and you ride out here the morning after." "I'm not responsible for the weather," Voss said. "No," Wyatt said, "you're not." He looked at the man with the papers. What's the claim? The man recited it. The specific territorial provision, the outstanding debt amount, $31, the assertion that under the third condition of spousal interest, there was a potential liability that could affect property arrangements. Wyatt looked at Eliza. She stepped forward. The Cassidy records show no joint liability, she said. I have the documentation. Abe Finch has provided a signed statement regarding the conditions of our departure from the property. And I have $9.40 in cash and a standing arrangement with Court Hale that will produce the remaining $21.60 within 30 days against work already performed. The man with the papers looked at Voss. Voss looked at the yard, at the barn, at the wind barriers, at the cattle in the back pasture. He had come here expecting to find the aftermath of a disaster, a ranch half buried, cattle losses, a woman who had overreached and failed, giving him the evidence he needed to make Wyatt feel the cost of having let her stay. What he found was a ranch that had moved its cattle off a fence line in a blizzard at 3 in the morning and brought them all back except one who was already recovered. He stood in the yard for a moment with the expression of a man who had prepared for a conversation that was no longer available. 30 days, the man with the papers said. He was addressing this to Eliza, not Voss. If the amount is cleared in full within 30 days, the inquiry closes. It will be, Eliza said. Voss looked at her. He looked at Wyatt on the porch. Then he looked at the south pen. Buried and battered, but the fence still standing above the snow where the drift hadn't quite reached the tops of the posts. The barrier beside it, angular and ugly and doing exactly the thing it had been built to do. A woman who arrived with nothing, he said. It was almost to himself. It had the quality of a man repeating something he'd said before and hearing it differently. That's still true, Eliza said. I arrived with nothing. What I've got now, I built here. Voss turned and walked back to his horse. The man with the papers followed, glancing back once with the look of someone who had just witnessed something he would be describing to people for a while. Wyatt watched them ride down the track. He said from the porch, Court Hale's 30 days. $21.60, she said, against the barrier work. He already agreed. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. You planned that before the storm, he said. I planned it before the Pruitt visit, she said. The storm just changed the timeline. He looked at her for a long moment. The cold around them was still sharp and total, the kind that existed after a serious storm had passed and left the air scoured and precise. Clara appeared in the doorway behind Wyatt in her coat, already on her way to the barn. Silver? Eliza said. Silver, Clara said, and went past Wyatt down the steps without slowing. Mason stood in the yard looking at the fence he'd helped cut open in the dark, in the wind, at 3 in the morning. We have to fix that in spring, he said. We do, Eliza said. I'll help, he said. It was not an offer. It was a statement of intention, the kind a person made when they'd decided that something was theirs to do. Eliza looked at her son in the white, cold morning light, standing in the yard of a ranch that had come through the night. I know you will, she said. The 30 days passed the way hard things pass. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular weight of time that has a deadline attached to it. Eliza worked. She finished the barrier installations on Hale's property in 2 sessions across the first week of January, working through cold that had settled into something permanent feeling, the kind of cold that stopped being an event and became a condition. Hale paid what they'd agreed without being asked twice, counting out the bills on his kitchen table with the deliberate honesty of a man who respected a deal that had been kept. $21.60. She held it on the ride home and didn't say much. Wyatt's ankle had healed enough by then for him to manage the daily ranch work, though he was still favoring it in the evenings when the cold aggravated the repair. He didn't complain about it. She'd noticed that he didn't complain about physical things as a general rule. Not from pride exactly, more from the practical understanding that complaining changed nothing about the ankle and used energy that could go towards something useful. She'd come to recognize this quality in him. She had a version of it herself. It was one of the things that made the house function without friction. On the 15th of January, Eliza rode to the land broker's office in Harker County. She went alone. Wyatt offered to come. She thanked him and said no, and he accepted this without argument because he understood, as he'd come to understand several things about her, that this particular errand needed to be hers. The broker's office smelled the same as it always did, coal smoke and old paper, and the faint dampness of a building that didn't fully warm in winter. The The clerk behind the counter was not Cassidy, but a younger man who looked at her with the neutral efficiency of someone processing a transaction. She put $31 on the counter, $9.40 of her own cash, accumulated over 4 months of careful saving, $21.60 from Hale. She'd made up the remaining gap from the sale of 2 hooked rugs to Della Marsh in December, which had felt circular in a way she appreciated. The work of her hands closing the account that someone else's absence had opened. The clerk counted it, made a notation, stamped a paper. He slid the paper across the counter. She looked at it for a moment, just looked at it. The stamp, the date, the amount, the notation that read, "Paid in full, no remaining claim." She folded it in half and put it inside her coat, close against her chest where the cold couldn't reach it. She rode home. The trading post was on the way back and she stopped there, not because she needed to, but because there was one more thing. Abe Finch was behind the counter, which he always was. He looked up when she came in with the particular attentiveness of a man who tracked the storylines of his customers the way other people tracked weather systems. "It's done?" he said. "It's done," she said. He nodded once. Then he reached under the counter and set something on the surface between them. She looked at it. It was the sewing machine. Not her exact sewing machine. That one had been sold and was long gone. But the same model, the same age approximately, with the same iron treadle and the same cabinet style, acquired at some point by Abe through the back and forth of trading post commerce. "Been holding this since October," he said. "Figured you'd be coming in eventually." She looked at it. At the iron wheel, the thread spindle, the worn wood of the cabinet that had been worn by someone else's hands before hers would wear it further. She looked at Abe. "What do you want for it?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Consider it what it is." She put her hand on the cabinet. Something moved in her chest that she didn't try to name because naming it would have made it harder to carry, and she had a long ride back and things to do when she got there. "Thank you, Abe," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just keep doing what you've been doing out there. Good for all of us to see it done." She loaded the sewing machine into the wagon and drove home through the cold January afternoon with the folded paper inside her coat and the sewing machine on the wagon bed behind her, and the particular quality of the light in that hour. Thin, precise, winter light that didn't ask for anything from you and didn't offer anything except clarity. Felt like the right kind of light for the day. When she got back to the ranch, Clara saw the wagon from the barn door and came out at a run with Silver behind her, because Silver had reached the age and condition where he followed Clara through the yard the way a dog follows a person it has decided to belong to. Clara saw the sewing machine. She stopped. She looked at her mother on the wagon seat. "Is that not the same one?" Eliza said, "but close enough." Clara put her hands on the side of the wagon and looked at the machine for a moment with the serious attention she brought to things that mattered. "It came home," she said. Eliza climbed down from the wagon. "Something like that." Mason came out of the barn next, then Wyatt from the south fence line where he'd been checking the posts they'd reset after the storm. He looked at the wagon, looked at Eliza's face, read what he needed to read there. He didn't say anything about the debt. He just came over and helped carry the sewing machine inside. That evening, after supper, Wyatt stayed at the table after the children had gone up. He poured himself a second coffee, which he rarely did, and he sat with it and looked at the table in the way he sat and looked at things when he had something to say but was working out how to say it. Eliza waited. She was getting good at waiting for him to arrive at the sentence he'd been building. "I want to talk about the arrangement," he said finally. She looked at him. "It's been 5 months," he said. "It has." "The arrangement we made at the gate? It made sense then. It doesn't describe what's here now." She was quiet. He looked up from the table. "This isn't a temporary situation. What you've done to this ranch, the barn, the barriers, the hay, the hail trade, the storm, that's not the work of someone passing through." He paused. "And your children are not guests." "No," she said. "They're not." "I want to make it permanent," he said. "Not the arrangement. Something else. Something with paper behind it if you want paper, or just said between us if that's enough." He held her gaze. "I'm not good at talking around things." "I know," she said. "Then I won't," he said. "Stay. Not as the woman who fixed the barn, as the person who lives here, you and Mason and Clara. This is your home if you want it to be." Eliza sat with that for a moment. She thought about the gate 5 months ago. The dirt track and the worn blanket and the 43 cents, and the way she'd stood at someone else's fence and offered work because work was the only honest thing she had. She thought about the boots on the kitchen table. She thought about 2 in the morning in the barn and the wrong warmth smell and Wyatt's voice saying, "I was going to say that you called it tonight." She thought about Thomas, not with bitterness, but with the clear-eyed understanding that came when you'd finally processed something enough to see its shape. Thomas had made things easy by hiding things. Wyatt was making something difficult by saying it directly. The difference between the two was the entire distance between a house she'd lost and a home she might build. "Yes," she said. He nodded. One short, complete nod. Neither of them said anything else for a while because the thing had been said and the quiet after it was not empty but full, the particular fullness of words that have finally landed where they were supposed to. The spring came in stages, the way spring always did in Montana, tentative and then retreating and then tentative again, as though the season was making sure winter had finished its business before committing. The snow pulled back from the south slopes first, revealing the gray-brown grass underneath, matted and compressed but still there. The fence came back in April. Mason did most of the post-work. He'd grown, not just physically, though that too, but in the deliberate, unshowy way that boys grow when they've been learning real things from people who didn't make the learning feel like instruction. He set the posts with a level and trusted it the way Bergstrom had trusted his, and he ran the wire without being directed. Wyatt watched him work for a while one morning from the gate. He said nothing. But that evening at supper he mentioned to Mason that if he kept at it, there'd be real ranch work in it for him come summer. Not chore work, not boys' work, but the actual daily business of running a cattle operation. Mason received this information with the careful composure of someone trying not to show how much it mattered. He didn't entirely succeed. Eliza saw it and said nothing, which was the right thing. Silver had become, by April, a fully improbable success. He was healthy, strongly built for his age, and devoted to Clara with a specificity that other people found amusing and Clara found entirely natural. Wyatt had said once, watching Clara and Silver move across the yard together, that he'd never seen an animal so convinced it was a person's specific responsibility. Clara had said, "He's not my responsibility. He's my friend." Wyatt had looked at her for a moment and then said, "Fair enough." On a morning in early May, Eliza was at the kitchen window when she saw Gideon Voss ride past on the road beyond the property. He didn't stop. He didn't turn in at the gate. He rode past at a pace that suggested he wasn't going anywhere particular or was going somewhere but not in a hurry, and he glanced once at the ranch, at the barriers, at the barn, at the general state of a property that had come through the winter intact, and then continued down the road. That was all. No conversation. No further pressure. Just a man riding past a place that had not become the ruin he'd expected, seeing that clearly, and moving on. Eliza watched him go. She thought about what Della had said in November. He's not doing this because of your husband's debts. He's doing it because Wyatt hasn't needed him. Voss had needed Wyatt to need him. And Wyatt, with 5 months of a different arrangement behind him, needed him less than ever. There was nothing left for Voss to use. She turned back to the stove. Some things end not with confrontation, but with the gradual removal of the conditions that made them possible. She'd learned that. You didn't always get to close a door on your problems. Sometimes the problems just ran out of room. She was thinking about this, about doors and rooms and the way things end, when Wyatt came in from the yard and poured his coffee and sat down and said, "Hale wants to know if you'd come look at his north pasture drainage. He thinks there's a grade problem." "There is," she said. "I saw it in November." He looked at her. "I didn't say anything because we had enough going on," she said. He almost smiled. The ghost of a smile, the one she'd come to watch for. "Can you fit it in?" he said. "Next week," she said, "after the fence is done." He nodded and drank his coffee, and that was that. This is what she would think about later, when she had the distance to see it clearly. That the life she built at Holloway Ranch was not built in the dramatic moments, though there were dramatic moments. It was built in the spaces between them. In the coffee at 6 that she made before anyone asked. In the level that Mason learned to trust. In the particular angle of a wind barrier that redirected force instead of opposing it. She had arrived with nothing. That was true. But nothing is not the same as having nothing to offer. She'd had her hands and her mind in the habit of looking at things long enough to understand them. She'd had 2 children who were paying attention to everything she did, which meant she'd had to be someone worth paying attention to even when she was exhausted and scared and not certain of the next step. That's the thing nobody says about survival. It's not about being strong. Strong is a word people use when they don't want to describe what it actually is, which is something quieter and less photogenic. It's about continuing, about doing the next task, about noticing the wrong warmth smell in the barn at 2 in the morning and not walking past it, about cutting the fence when every instinct says protect it, about understanding where the wind wants to go. The woman who walked through the gate with a worn blanket and 43 cents and 2 children who were watching her face to understand how scared to be. She did not become someone else. She did not transform into something stronger or harder or more capable than she already was. She was already capable. She just needed a door and someone willing to open it. Wyatt had opened it thinking he was saving them. They had saved each other. That's how it usually works, if you look at it honestly. The person you think you're rescuing is also the one keeping you from becoming too accustomed to your own silence. The children you're protecting are also protecting you, just in the quieter way that children protect parents, by making the alternative to continuing feel impossible. And the ranch, this piece of land that had been surviving by luck and stubbornness and one man's refusal to quit, became something built by 4 people who each brought the specific thing the others needed most. That's not a fairy tale. That's just what happens when people decide to work beside each other honestly. On a warm May evening, Eliza sat on the porch with coffee going cold in her hand and watched Clara and Silver move through the yard in the last light of the day. Mason was at the fence line, checking his own work the way careful people check things they've built, not from doubt, but from the satisfaction of finding it sound. Wyatt was in the barn. She could hear the low murmur of him talking to the horses, which was something he did that she suspected he didn't know she'd noticed. The northwest wind moved through the dry grass at the property's edge. She felt it, and she did not flinch. She knew where it was going.